This master Swin that we hear about, as far as we can tell, never existed. We have this text, it's not called The Art of War, that's a later attribution. There are all these Enlightenment military writers, and they keep writing books called
The Art of War by Sun Tzu is absolutely everywhere. It's quoted in boardrooms, it's assigned on university syllabuses, and it's even taught in military academies. On top of that, it's been adapted for managers, executives, and it's heavily quoted on online trading and investment courses. I was even given a copy as a birthday present when I was a teenager, like it was some kind of manual for life. Yet this really popular version that most people recognize is entirely a modern construction. In this episode, we're joined by Professor Peter Lorge to explore how Master Sun emerged as a cultural figure, how the title The Art of War placed the text inside a Western genre, and how Enlightenment thinkers and Cold War translators reshaped its meaning, changes that still shape how strategy is understood today.
So it's Sun Tzu, and this master Swin that we hear about, as far as we can tell, never existed.
Wow, okay.
So fundamentally, and I think that's in the first chapter or two of the book, I talked a little bit about that. And this is very shocking to people in the West. I've had people get very upset about that. It's right up there with when I said that Chinese martial arts doesn't come from Shaolin. And there were people who lost their minds about that concept. You know, they said, I think someone actually said, he doesn't believe, how can he not believe that? So
Out of interest, where does Chinese martial arts come from?
well, it's like all martial arts. It's been around since before we have records. So Sun Tzu is our first account of him so the first recovered text we get with that name ascribed to it is, I believe, 3rd century BCE. And that text is pretty consistent with what we have transmitted. So we know that this text has been around for, what called 2,300 years. It is clear if you read in the original that it is not the work of a single author. There are stylistic moves. It's just, I think it's chapter 9 or 11. One of those it's just a mess where you suddenly are like, wait a minute. And the work of John Sullivan, who's done some really interesting stuff on showing that if you read the Sun Tzu carefully and you compare it to earlier historical accounts like Zhuochuan, you can actually find passages that are kind of a little bit baffling, and you realize they're actually not baffling when you realize it's actually a summary of what's happened in history. So there's this thing about if you rush your army, the generals of the 3 armies will be captured. That's not an abstract thought. That actually refers to a historical event.
Okay.
And so this John Sullivan's work has been phenomenal. It's really new stuff and showing that what the Sun Tzu is it's a summary in a certain sense of the strategic wisdom of Warring States period China, of Spring and Autumn period China. And that's not to say it's wrong or anything. It's just you have to see that context. And what I tend to argue, and I mention a little bit in the book, is that it's a limited war text as opposed to unlimited war text. And we can get into the distinctions there. I mean, I also teach Western strategic thought, so I tend to describe the Chinese stuff in those terms for Western audiences. But Sun Tzu himself is this constructed figure. If there was a Master Sun, then we don't really know much about him. So I think of it more as it's a school of thought. So, and when I say not so much just a school of thought, it may have actually been a school. So an actual thing where these guys were being trained in this. So there is no Master Sun, but we have this text attributed. It's not called The Art of War, it's just the Master Sun. That's a later attribution. We won't deal with that. Then we get to Sima Qian, who's a Han Dynasty historian, 2nd, 1st century BCE, and he creates categories of kinds of individuals in this history he writes. And one of the categories, the categories are very interesting because we're still stuck with them. And so that's anytime someone starts saying to you, history is just fashion, and you're like, Yeah, if that fashion lasts 2,000 years, it's hard to, So he creates the category of Taoists. He creates the category of Ruists, which we translate now sometimes as Confucianists. And he creates the category of the Bingjia, the militarists. And in that chapter, he gives three paradigmatic biographies: Master Swin, Master Wu, and a man named Master Swin Bin. Master Wu, we know him. He was a historical figure. We have his text. He's the Wu Qi, and his text is usually, he's the second greatest Chinese strategist. And his stuff always gets transmitted with Sun Tzu. Master Swin's biography is very clearly a, what was that fancy term for? But it's basically, it's a shadow uh, imitation of this other general, Wu Zishu. And you can see it if you look at his biography. It's the same thing. And so, and then Swin Bin is possibly supposed to be a descendant of Swinza. He has the same surname. Uh, what's interesting is Swin Bin's his book of strategy ends up being lost for 2,000 years. It's rediscovered in the 1970s. So we have this idea of this guy who is the story of him using the concubines to form up, and Chinese later traditional Chinese scholars, at least as early as the 11th century, realized there was no Sunzi. I mean, that's the earliest we have someone who says this guy couldn't have existed because if he were that important, he would have shown up in the histories, and he doesn't. So they're not, there's a really interesting thing that happens where we forget that the people in the past were intelligent. And somehow they're supposed to be just accepting everything. And, we get this idea that there's this Confucian scholar and they just accept everything. And what you read them and they're very skeptical. And you have these guys saying, well, we shouldn't read this text. It's crap. But what happens is in the third century, Cao Cao, who is a warlord, that's as neutral a term as I can give him, writes a commentary on Sunzi. And this begins an intellectual tradition of writing commentaries on the Sunzi. And that culminates, to my mind, and certainly in what I'm going to write in the next few years, in the 13th century, when 11 commentaries are collected into one book by an unknown person, and we get this thing of Sunzi's Art of War with the 11 commentaries. And it starts with Cao Cao, and it ends by this guy we don't know who he is. And what's interesting about these guys is that as far as we can tell, none of them were generals. Now I have to amend that with Cao Cao. Cao Cao writes his commentary before he becomes a general. So, and I was going to do a project and I may still do it with a Chinese scholar, on trying to see whether if you compare what he said in his commentary with what he did in his wars.
Oh wow, interesting. Yeah, if he applied
If he
his
applied
theory
it,
in practicality. Yeah.
and it hasn't been done, and it's sort of an interesting project. COVID made things difficult on that. So we have so, but what this speaks to is that there's a most of most of the way that Swinza has been used is by educated men who were not generals. So we have very little we have very little information about generals actually somehow
Applying
using,
this.
yeah, applying it.
Yeah.
Arthur Waldron said in the 1920 about the wars in the 1920s that generals would trot out Swinza after they failed. So if they lost a battle, they would then begin to, as they begin their defense, they would sort of describe it in Swinza terms. This guy, and that was they didn't do it when they were planning to go in, but they used it as a way to defend themselves on the other side of it, and so and so it's this very interesting thing about, and this I should say this is more widespread in military history as a whole. It's always been very difficult to connect a strategic text or a text of thought to actual campaigns. It's a very challenging issue because, well, in China, for most part, the generals were not literate. There were literate generals, but for the most part, they weren't. The ones who were positioning themselves very carefully. There's a whole other issue with that, which again we take a lot of time for. So we have this situation of we have a text whose most frequent, you don't, I should say, it is almost never cited in court debates. So you don't have this thing where the guys are talking about what should we do in this war, and someone says, Swinza said this, and the other guy said, well, but he also said this, and you don't have this kind of hermeneutic of warring quotes, and that's just not what happens. And I have the dynasty I study, the Sung, one of the architects of its creation, says stuff in accounts of debates we have that you can't find. So he'll say something like, according to Bing Fa, which is, say, The Art of War, and this means the art of war more generally, not a specific book. He says, taking something fast is better than taking something slow. And then so we now have computers where you can do a digital search. So you take that quote and you drop it in and you get nothing. So all these guys who are writing about Swinza is becomes, at least from my perspective, it becomes an intellectual tradition to read Swinza and to write commentaries on it that has little to nothing to do with actual military campaigns. It does get cycled into the military exam system. So the seven military classics, which is created in the 11th century, is created as a curriculum for the military exams. But absent the military exams, there wasn't. So if you look at it, there weren't these seven military classics, these Wujing Qishu, before, what was it, 1083. And the only reason why those texts are chosen is because the emperor says these are the texts. And the guys involved in doing it, actually, at one point, one of the junior guys says to the senior guy, like, well, one of these texts is a forgery. And why are we there's 50 years of debate about what texts should be in the curriculum, and the emperor, being the emperor, he settles it. He says these are the texts, and there is no explanation for why those texts. Well, I should say, clearly there was an extensive debate of which we have only fragmentary remains, of these guys arguing about, and they set up exams and they take the exams down and they say this text and then that, and we have like pieces of this. And at some point, Emperor Shenzong just says, these are the seven texts. Go create, go do a good job editing them. They do it. They're applied in the exams, and then they become standardized.
You said it's not even called The Art of War. How does that name get attached to the text then? And how has it become so? And I guess this then relates to the question I did want to ask, which is, how does Sun Tzu's work get transferred into the Western world? And how is that kind of like the reactions behind that? How does that all kind of go?
Okay, so the earliest we get, so a Jesuit missionary, Father Amio, translates Swinza into French. I guess it's published first in 1772, if I'm remembering correctly. He is part of this correspondence with Enlightenment guys in France. But the tie to Enlightenment is very important here because there are all these Enlightenment military writers, and they keep writing books called The Art of War. So what happens is you end up in translator realm, and in the translator realm it gets fit into the Western genre, and that's why it gets this title. And then Vanya Bellinger did a fabulous paper at this conference earlier this year in which she showed that in fact that Clauswitz had almost 100% certainly read this French translation of Swinza. It was around in this time period, the end of the 18th century, beginning of 19th century. It was available in French, and of course every civilized, educated person read French. So this text it slots into the Enlightenment side because those are the guys who import it to France. And so there's this fundamental juxtaposition, between Clausewitz and Swinza, which then gets reproduced somewhat unconsciously by Little Hart in his preface to the Samuel Griffith 1963 translation. And so we have this kind of, and we've now set up this contrast, oddly, in that, Clausewitz represents Western military thought, or the culmination of Western military thought, direct, overwhelming mass, all kinds of, and then you get those sort of negative characterizations of that. And then you have Sun Tzu as this representing essentially the rest of the world, but China in particular as indirect and cunning, and you say, well, wait a minute, but Sun Tzu was slotted into European Enlightenment thinking about war. And if you actually read those texts, you realize that, Clausewitz is writing against European military thought as much as he is, so there's a, I don't want to say a lack of education on this, there's just a simplification.
So would it be fair to say then that Clausewitz is influenced, or at least would be aware and have read Sun Tzu's work? So although it's been simplified to argue that Clausewitz is countering
Yeah.
this other theory of war, in many ways he's actually reproducing it, or at least reevaluating it.
Oh, so then now we have the question of influence.
Yeah.
And influence without, footnotes or somebody's diary saying, I was
Explicitly.
explicitly,
Yeah.
it gets very complicated. I mean, I just actually I was just writing a book review of something, and I had to say, this is as obscure a set of discussions as you could possibly imagine. It's about a Chinese book on the first book on historiography ever written, which happens to be Chinese, and an
Yeah.
argument that a later guy from the 11th century was influenced stylistically by it. And it's like, you can't, you just can't, you can't do anything with that because style is such a, there's so many things going on there. So,
Yeah.
and of course, Clausewitz has been badly simplified. He
Mm.
was, and I should say, when I was, 25 years ago, I had a very simple and somewhat negative view of Clausewitz. And as I've been teaching it, and as I've been getting older, and again, it may just be an age thing, Clausewitz makes much more sense. He's much more nuanced. You read the guy, and you're like, and of course, it helps that nowadays also a lot more of his work is being translated. So now you actually start reading. I just finished reading the translation of his accounts of the French army in Italy, and was it 1796-7 in Italy. And you read the guy and you're like, I mean, he's snarky as hell, and he's a lot. I mean, you kind of think this guy would be really kind of fun to be around. Maybe not, he's Prussian, but you're thinking like, wow, he was like a funny, an amusing Prussian, or was he just sort of really bitingly sarcastic in that German
Yeah.
mode? And you read him and you think, wow, this guy, but if you read Clausewitz, if you read On War Now, and you don't have a preconceived notion about what he's saying, you see a really smart, really experienced guy who worked really hard to try to encompass war. His manuscript is worked on by his wife, and again, look at Vanya Bellinger's book on Madame Clausewitz, and her brother, who is also a general, who went through Clausewitz's work and edited it as best they could. But she knew what he was doing, and they tried to, render a solid version of what he was saying. But his thinking was changing. He had shifted, and that's very. So we have this thing where we have this partial text, and then we have people who for various reasons decide to characterize it in certain ways for their purposes. And then we end up with this dichotomy of, Clausewitz versus Swinza, which is it's really false. And but that doesn't sell well, which is probably why I will never, be buying really expensive wine based on my writing on Chinese military thought, which is a shame. I mean, I can manage some really good tea sometimes.
I would love then to know what are some of the key differences in the interpretation of Sun Tzu's strategies between Eastern and Western cultures, because it seems as though in the West, like I remember growing up and kind of, I think, hitting 15 or 16, and for my birthday getting Sun Tzu's Art of War, the Book of Five Rings,
Yeah, yeah. Go to No Show
something,
is a great book.
yeah, and a few others that were all kind of classified on Amazon as kind of military
Yeah.
philosophy, or some other kind of relevant description. Now, how is what the West has interpreted from the original, yeah, kind of like, how does that, I guess, play to Western cultural ideals, and how does that differ then, I guess, from its Eastern understanding or its original understanding?
Yeah, so this is the, I mean, you've hit right on the nail right on the head. And I was about, when I was 15, I was doing about basically the same thing, and I was reading Musashi, and I was doing martial arts, and I was trying to grasp this, and then you find out that, Musashi is a really weird figure too, because there might have been two or three guys named Musashi. Um, and I did an encyclopedia entry on him a long time ago. And somehow guns can't be Chinese. Oh, that's a weird one, because that's pretty clear. So what happens is certain things. Why do guns and gunpowder get detached from China? And my tentative answer right now, and I don't know whether I'll have the patience to nail this down academically, is that guns and gunpowder are way too important for European imperialism and colonialism, which is, by the way, the basis of industrialization and modernity, which Europe claims. So if modernity, Industrial Revolution and modernity as we understand it, and science and technology and all that cool Western stuff, if it is based on Chinese technology or China's contribution, and let's not even go and talk about things like math and, or as you guys would say it, maths, and all the things that come from other cultures. But let's separate that entirely and say, if you don't have modernity without the contribution of Chinese culture, huh, well, that's a big deal, isn't it? Because without the guns, imagine these European traders get on their ships, they sail around the world, and they don't have military superiority. The
Hmm.
world's a very different place,
Yeah, changes the narrative. Yeah.
very profoundly. So guns get separated from China because it's too important. For me, this issue is that China has a very direct and obvious contribution to the modern world and to the concepts of modernity. There are other aspects with respect to Chinese intellectual texts, Confucianism, and Confucianism as a concept is actually a Western concept of this Ruism, these Ru who we translate as Confucians, but that's a very people have begun to notice even in my field that I usually refer to Ruists, not Confucians, because it's a very and there's a whole argument about that. I'm not the only one, I should say. I'm not I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah.
I'm not that creative or original, but it's this concept that comes in where for missionaries who want to convert the Chinese, they find out that your educated Chinese official, your educated Chinese member of the gentry, is not going to convert to Christianity. Really hard, and because they're so thoroughly indoctrinated with Ruism. So what they do is they construct this idea of Confucians who are remarkably Christian, except for the Christ part. So somehow they figure, well, actually, if you look at Confucianism, it's really Christianity. They just somehow lost the Jesus part. And if all we need to do is put the Jesus part back in, and they'll all be Christians. And so they create this idea that the Confucians are rationalists, uh, non-religious, and then there's this Taoism and Buddhism. We got to get rid of that stuff. But of course, this pushes all of the spiritual and religious aspects of Ruism out, which we're now only now in the late 20th and into the early 21st century, recovering and realizing there's a whole spiritual religious aspect to Ruism, Confucianism. But when I was learning it, it was always like the Confucians are these rational guys, and then there are these Buddhists and Taoists, and they're the religious guys. And I never really thought about it. It didn't make a lot of, and then you're trying to mesh all these other things in. And I think we're just we've had the chance to go back and look at it, and it's much more interesting now. But all of this comes back to your question about how the West looks at China, but also how the West looks at the rest.
And you've spoken about Samuel Griffith's translation. Like, what role does that translation play in popularizing Sun Tzu's teachings in the West? And would it be fair to say that without that translation, we would possibly, I guess, not even be having this podcast? It might not have become as popular as it is today in the kind of the popular culture.
Yeah, well, that is, that's my argument in this book, which is that Griffith was the right man at the right time, and he was supported by Basil Littlehart. So he hit that moment. He was a China Marine. He had fought. He was a I mean, let's just say Griffith was an extraordinary individual, just amazing. And he'd been in China. He had learned Chinese. He learned classical Chinese. He did his DPhil at Oxford after he retired. Yeah, so this is a guy who he went into the Marine Corps. He fought all over the world. He was in China. He's in World War II. He fights, he's a Marine Raider, which is this incredible group that's functional for about 2 years. Churchill convinces Roosevelt that he should have a commando group. But so Griffith comes into the Marine Raiders after this. He's involved in this incredible group. He fights on Guadalcanal, which is this astonishing Marine fight against the Japanese. He gets wounded there. He's a command. I mean, so this he's been in battle. He's been in China. He was actually when the communists, the Chinese communists are fighting against the Japanese, and he's actually a liaison officer with the Japanese army for the U.S. before there's a war. And he retires. They promote him to brigadier general, upon retirement. He goes and does his DPhil at Oxford. And what does he do? He translates Sun Tzu's Art of War. Well, before he did that, when he was still a Marine, he translated Mao's strategic work on guerrilla warfare and published it in the Marine Corps Journal. So now, but you have to keep this association in mind. So now we're getting into the 1950s, 1960s. So 1950s, we get the Korean War. So that's sorry, obviously 1945, 49, we have the Chinese communists take over China. So now we have this idea about, oh my God, the Chinese communists, what have they done? Oh, this guy Mao, he wrote all this stuff. And Mao was, how did the communists defeat these nationalist Chinese armies trained by the United States? Oh, this is a mystery. And somehow they began to imagine that it's this guerrilla warfare that Mao was doing. Well, so Griffith he's working on things and he's dealing with Little Heart, and he puts out this translation in 1963. Little Heart uses it. And partly he is intentional in this, and partly it's kind of intuitive for him. He says Swinza is advocating indirect warfare, as I have been. And therefore, the fact that Swinza's been around for 2,000 years vindicates my indirect strategy that I've been pushing. And we have this association between Swinza and Mao, and guerrilla warfare and indirect warfare. And who personifies that? Griffith himself, who ties all of these things together. And he was a general. And we just had the Korean War. So now, through Griffith and his translation and Little Heart and Mao, we have tied Swinza to Mao and to indirect strategy. And that's how the Chinese communists won against the nationalists. And that's why it was so hard for us to fight them in the Korean War. Now, So that's your but so people were ripe for that in the 1960s, and now and then, because we have in the United States and in Europe we have this sort of counterculture movement, what the 1960s and all that cool stuff. So things Chinese, things Oriental. We start getting big. Yoga starts getting really big, and all of this stuff, and everybody's like, "Yeah, I'm going to listen to Ravi Shankar," and hey, look, listening to Ravi Shankar is really cool. So good benefit for you. And we're going to practice yoga, and we're going to be rooting for the insurgents and the guerrillas who are fighting against the capitalist European imperialist colonialist powers. Okay, great. And into this comes this military text which subverts and appears to fight and overturn our Western ways of war and defeat it through like not being violent and being anti-war. And that's how it arrives. And you're exactly right. I think without Griffith and his translation and the timing, it just wouldn't have been there. And so like a historian is supposed to do, I come in and try to pop everyone's bubbles and ruin their entire childhoods and their concepts of things and say, none of that, just
Actually, has happened. Yeah.
nothing has happened. Then people are really like, oh. And I realized that I had already thought through this before. I was not at a stage to
Nice.
write it down. And so
Yeah.
I have progressed not a centimeter, I'll say that in metrics for you, not a millimeter since I was in my 20s. And here it is, this text, and you realize, but now because I have written this book, because of the ensuing decades of study, I can, in a much more educated fashion, say, no, look, Mao's thought is conventional, it's Western. Even his guerrilla writings, his guerrilla strategy is conventional. It's not, I mean, people, and we have huge arguments about what's conventional, unconventional, irregular. This is insanity. It can't be resolved. But of course, I mean, when I say ongoing debates, I'm talking about like earlier this year. We had a discussion about this because the US military has redefined irregular warfare. And then you say, well, what's the difference between irregular and unconventional? You know, so, but Mao, so then the question is, on top of all of that, does any of this impact the current Chinese People's Liberation Army? So you have the PLA, and you say, well, are they affected by this? And there's a wonderful guy, Mike Metcalf, who keeps sending me. It's like Santa Claus. He sends me these Chinese articles where the PLA are trying to figure. Every time I'm sitting down, like, okay, I'm fine. And then Mike sends me some collection of Chinese articles that were pushing Sun Tzu's strategy in the PLA, and I'm like, woohoo! Stop
Evidence.
everything. Yeah. Um, and he just sent me something on like Vietnamese translations of Russian articles translating Vietnamese translations using Sun Tzu. And so we have this it's let's say on so one level there's the academic question, but there's a very serious question here about trying to understand how somebody else does strategy. And you read a book, how does it affect you? And if you're a really good strategist, your sum total of being a good strategist cannot be broken down to which individual texts. Hopefully, you might attribute back to your old teacher who might have taught you something. But you always, I think it's every academic's dream that somebody is successful and they come back and they say, well, it was, you taught
It
it to me
was
and that's
you.
why I did that.
Yeah.
But they don't do that. They don't call, they don't write, they just forget you, or they don't even make donations in your name to the university so that your dean will care who you are.
Oh,
Not that I'm complaining.
no,
Never
no, I couldn't.
complain.
I couldn't gather. No,
No, no,
never.
no, no. I never complain. And like I said, although I've been very fortunate, I had someone who I taught Western strategic thought to as an undergraduate who's come back. He's doing his PhD now, and he said to me, and he just did a field with me, and he was rereading stuff that he had learned, and going deeper. Go, oh, okay, and there's more to this. It's well, and unless you go on, you don't realize that the what level the person, they were teaching you. And when you're an undergraduate, you imagine if you get an A in a class that you have mastered it. And maybe you've mastered that bit that the teacher sort of, I pulled out this bit part, you mastered that bit. And if you go on and you realize, oh, wait, this was a simplified. Yeah, and to be honest, and a, a very small percentage of students realize that in their junior and senior years. And you can actually watch a student's mind, they suddenly realize that they're at a university, if you're at most universities, that the person teaching your class knows a lot more than you're getting in the class. And not so much, this is not just to say, okay, stop, but understand that there's more going on, and those students really they actually appreciate things more because they understand, I'm getting a piece. And that's really cool. And I'm very privileged to have someone teaching me this. And I'm still understanding stuff that my teachers taught me decades ago. And it's a very interesting process. And like I said, since I've progressed not at all, except to realize that, boy, I missed out because that person knew a lot more and I didn't ask them. I didn't even know what to ask. Let alone,
Yeah, yeah,
I didn't know what to ask. I didn't know I could ask. I didn't know there was more to it. And
yeah,
so all of these concepts are really important. And what one hopes is that if you can get people to recognize that, and by people, I mean not just generals and politicians, but the general populace, that we get to something that's a little more, what do you want to say? I hate to say rational, that's a very bad term, but not, there's an awful lot of bad strategy around. And when we look at things, as when you look at the past, when you only have people's actions to judge by, you try to imagine that they were doing good strategy. Why did they do that? It's like if you look at you say, why is that guy going out with that woman? And why did they get married? And you can go through all the arguments, and um, but we kind of know that a lot of those things are really not. That may not be what happened. So when various things happen in the world, and something happens and someone says, "Oh, we'll do this," well, why? And war is any rational approach to war would say, don't go to war.
yeah, completely.
And
Yeah,
and yet people keep doing it. Well,
yeah.
it's all right, you see people keep getting married to the wrong people, and has all
That
kinds of
is just the
negative
nature.
consequences.
Yeah, yeah,
And their friends
definitely.
know. They're like, dude, don't do that.
Yeah.
Stop.
Please stop. Yeah, yeah. Stop. Stop before it's too late,
Yeah,
right?
sober up before you talk to that person.
You spoke about how in the 1960s there's this counterculture. Would it be fair to say then that that counterculture is influential in how Sun Tzu's Art of War has managed to transcend just the military? Because you hear about it in team sports,
Oh
you
yeah.
hear about it in cybersecurity, you hear about it everywhere. Like what is the context, I guess, behind it being able to have transcended past military and absorb into popular culture in really kind of strange ways?
Well, that's, and I'm guessing as much as anything because I
Yeah,
wouldn't know how you would study that. But yeah, it comes in. What happens is Swinza it becomes part of culture. The cover that I really wanted on the book, or at least on the back cover, was Paris Hilton reading a copy. There was a picture she staged this. So she's all dressed up, sitting in the thing, reading Swinza. And the first time, one of the pictures actually has the book upside down. And her point was that people carry these books around. They invoke these things that they really haven't read necessarily or understood to show something. And in the case of Swinza, they're trying to show that they are strategic. And I said to my editor, I said, "Yeah, could we get that image?" And she said, "Oh yeah, sure. I'll just ask her when I see her next." And I was like, "No, no, I'm serious." They're like, "Wait, you're serious?" And it's a fantastic image, and I really wanted to. I mean, of course, I said also from a publishing point of view, look, if you take a Paris Hilton picture and put it on the cover, or
Yeah. You're
however
gonna
many,
attract more attention.
yeah, yeah, however many tens of
Yeah.
millions of followers she has will
Yeah.
buy it. And if they buy it, who cares whether they read it? It's,
Yeah. Yeah. They've bought it.
better wine for me, better, more expensive tea. But hey, strategically speaking, it would have been a good play. Instead, we have a correct image, which is actually from the French text, the original Father Amio's text that came in, and we got it for free, and that was cool. I still want the Paris Hilton version, and if she's out there, anyone hears it, we should do a special edition for her people. But my point is that she's right. So that it becomes like so many, it's like the Tao Te Ching. And everyone's like, oh, Lao Tzu. And he's like, and Lao Tzu is so poorly treated in the West because all these people are like, I'm going to read Lao Tzu. And Lao Tzu is just like, oh, it's totally Taoist. And you're like, as if Taoism wasn't a serious system of thought. In the same way that, Buddhism gets treated. And I said to a neighbor years ago, she was like, oh, the Buddhist monks are coming to speak to our church. And I said, yo, that's really interesting. That's really great that you guys are doing sort of cross interfaith things, but you do understand that the Buddhists don't believe your stuff, right? Like, Buddhism is a separate religion. It's not, and it's interesting in the West, you'll get these people who don't sort of seem to grasp that Buddhism it is a religion. They are not like somehow n- like you can be like a Christian Buddhist or something. It's like they actually have a religion, and I had a student once when and I don't do a lot of Buddhism because I don't that's not my stuff. But I was talking about Buddhism, and I do a couple of classes on my survey, and some student says, but what's the point after you? And I said, the point is you're living a lie. You're like everything you think is real isn't. And you're you're in a delusion, this is ridiculous. And they're kind of like, whoa, not well, but it's not compatible with your other religion. If you're serious in your religion, your religious is not your and so what happens, yeah, yeah, but just because it's beyond your Judeo-Christian paradigm doesn't mean yeah, it's not compatible with it. Yeah, and it's just it completely invalidates it. So what are you doing? Or, at best they're kind of condescending, like, yeah, you can do that weird stuff you're doing, but it's kind of nonsense. I don't want to ruin your day by telling you it's not. Like, if you're doing the right thing, that's a good way on your path. You know, if a convenient methods was it upaya or whatever it is, you go do that, and maybe we can move. Hopefully, we'll maybe move you into out of your delusions later. And so what happens is you invoke these texts in the West. You call up Swinza to say, I'm being strategic. And I'm not being direct because direct is not strategic. It's, and look, if I'm bigger and stronger than you are, my best strategy is to run over you, just crush you. Use force. Why wouldn't I do that? Why would I invest in all this? I'm 56 and I'm fighting you know, 200 and I don't know, he's a big guy, a professional fighter on the mat. I am not going to smash him. I am not. I tried to move an arm on one of these guys at one point, and I had all the leverage, and I just couldn't do it. Like, not going to happen. So, would I like to be able to overpower him? Yes. It's not possible. So now, being strategic is understanding where your advantages are. But most people don't do strategy that way. So they pull out Swin's and they say, Swin's Guide to Dating, or Swin's Guide, because what they're just saying is, I am strategic. And they completely ignore the Western tradition of strategic thought, which is a whole tradition. It's very big, thick books written on that. And you can read all those books, and most of them have been translated into English. And they don't want to do that. And the other thing about Swinza, which has a huge advantage, is you can read. Swinza is very short. So you can read and misunderstand Swinza in an afternoon, whereas it would take you days to read and misunderstand Clausewitz. But you pull the book out, right? So you kind of invoke the book and say, here's my Swinza, so I'm being strategic. in the same way that, oh, here's my Tao Te Ching, so I'm being Taoist. And is it nonsense? Well, yes. It's because Swinza was also, there's a whole intellectual tradition of understanding that. And there's, but look, if you invoke Swinza and somehow you think you're following Swinza and it works for you, and you completely misunderstand it. But let's go with the Swinza and dating. And I believe there is such a book.
Yeah.
And it tells you whatever it tells you, and you're following what you believe, and it works
Works.
for you. You
Yeah,
get whatever out of it that you want,
yeah.
whatever that is. I'm not judging you here. And I come in and say to you, well, actually, you're doing it wrong. Well, that's not what Swinza said. And they go, oh, and you change, and now you're not getting out.
You don't get the same
Well,
results.
yeah,
Yeah.
but so my goal in this was to describe how it came in, and to some extent, for me, that's a way of clearing the decks so that I can now begin to talk about Chinese military thought in very serious, really boring academic ways. And this is fundamental, right? So you have this, and what's bizarre in all this is you say, look, understand that the text, and if we use this term Swinza, even though he didn't exist, but Swinza's idea here is, look, we're already fighting. The war is starting. That's why you're reading the book. So, this is like you're already in a war. Now, what do you do? So he's not starting from the like, don't start a war, you can this is a text that comes out of the Warring States period. There's continual warfare. So there's an assumption of continual warfare. That's a ground level assumption, that's a precursor to even looking at the book. So people sit there and say, why isn't he, he's not talking about that. Well, of course not. It's kind of like if you're reading a book on baseball, you're not talking about justifying baseball. You're already
You're in it. Yeah,
you're in
yeah,
it.
yeah. You're in the box.
You're in the book, so you're
Yeah.
obviously a fan, right? So
Yeah.
and so Swinza was not saying don't fight,
Yep.
nor did he say, don't attack a city. He said there are cities you shouldn't attack, but people don't read that as, but therefore there are
You
cities you
can.
should attack,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
or he says, if you do this, you will lose a lot of men. He's not saying, and he's suggesting that, people are reading that as a blanket condemnation. If you do this, you're going to lose a lot, so don't do that. What he's saying
Right.
is, look,
This is a risk.
understand. Yeah, A,
Yeah.
there's a risk, but B, you might have to do that.
Yeah.
Like, yes, there are, because the corollary of that is there are places you have to capture. There are
Yeah.
strategic things, and you have to be ready to, understand. And, if you're going into your boss and saying, look, we got to capture this city, it's going to be costly,
Yep.
but we got no choice.
Yeah.
And it's important in war. This is why we have a very uneducated populace in certainly I'll say in America. England is somewhat better about military stuff, but I suspect equally as bad in a lot of aspects. But in America, we have this concept. We have people who are really interested who are ignorant, and people who are really opposed who are also ignorant.
Yeah.
And somebody, I always tell my students that somebody in your lifetime some politician is going to say, we're going to have a war. Don't worry, it's going to be quick, it'll be easy, and it'll be over. And they're lying.
Yeah.
Because
As always.
yeah, well, you can't, if you come in and say to everyone, well, we're going to fight this terrible war, it's going to be way more expensive than you think. We're going to accomplish way less than you think. And it's going to be hard. It's going to take longer, cost more, accomplish less. Hey, let's do it.
Yeah.
If George W. Bush had said, we're going to go into Iraq, we're going to be there for a couple of decades. It's going to be cost us, and then we're going to leave without having really accomplished much.
And
Yeah,
spiral into everything else that's happened
yeah,
since.
it's spirals down. It people are going to go, wait, are you saying we're going to do this now?
Yeah.
And if you try to educate the populace on, how utterly ruthless and rationalist you need to be about these issues, and it's not nice. it's expensive, but it's a question of this is expensive, but to do the alternative is even more expensive.
More expensive,
Like,
yeah.
it's like Ukraine, and people are arguing in the United States, well, it's costing so much money. It's like, dude, this is cheap. We're using a tiny fraction of our budget to cause a massive problem for Russia. Oh yeah, yeah, we're helping the Ukrainians. But we're and if we can, and we're being ruthless here, right? For a relatively low amount of money, basically undermine Russian power. That actually undermines Chinese power. It undermines Iranian power. It does all of these things for cheap. And we're not putting our guys on the line. And it's alerted us to the fact, and this is a big problem in the United States and in the West, in Europe more generally, we have let our military industrial systems collapse. And apparently there are real threats out there. So maybe we need to rebuild them. Because if we don't,
Mm,
these powers like Russia and obviously by implication China and things like that may see us as weak. We can't produce enough artillery shells. We can't produce enough ships. Well, you now have an early warning that you've fallen
yeah,
behind. You better move on this and start doing. But of course, what is the problem there? It costs money.
yeah,
You got to raise taxes.
yeah.
You got to convince people to go into the U.S. military. We have a lot of people, I don't want to go into the military. Why would I do
No,
that? And partly that's because it's not attractive, and partly that's because the economy is actually pretty good. And someone said, well, I can make more money not waking up at 5 a.m. and marching up and back in the square. And so Russia did this thing, which was, we were all like, what the heck are they doing? Well, that's the problem. Rationally speaking, it didn't make sense to us. It made
yeah,
sense to Vladimir Putin.
yeah,
And all of our strategic thinking goes out the window when you have someone who's an individual who's in a position to launch something like this and perceives it to be in his best interest. And now we have a situation where you have the same guy who understands, because he's not stupid, that if he loses, that's when he gets kicked out of office and maybe dead.
yeah,
So now you have hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of billions of dollars being expended because one guy is afraid of being killed.
yeah,
Now, it makes perfect sense from his perspective right now, right?
yeah.
But it's not great for the rest of us. And
No,
you look around the world and you say, we can talk about any conflict going around. What was your game plan? What was your strategy? And your strategy might be good for you and bad for me. What I
yeah,
always like to cite is Shrek. Is some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. It's Lord Farquaad, right? And
yeah,
that is how leaders work. For my political well-being, I need to risk your life,
yeah,
and very bad for you, but it's necessary for me. And so strategically, it makes and strategy is at all levels, right? So I guess my point is that strategy is really important. Military history is really important in a very fundamental way. We don't teach it for all kinds of cultural reasons, for all kinds of political reasons, and politicians don't want it taught as, they don't want you to come in and say, you said we should going to go to war. I understand enough to know that that's just for you. That doesn't help me.
yeah,
So we have this kind of issue of education that it's not an argument about the Tao Te Ching. It's not an argument about your spirituality. It's an argument about sending in armies and blowing people up
yeah.
and killing people. And it's really, really serious, and we need to take it seriously, but we're not.
No. When it comes to the strategy, and politicians and others, putting it into play, by default, then the strategy has no bearing really to do with morality or ethics, because the whole ideal is essentially what works for me. Because if the politician's idea is I get ahead
Yeah.
at whatever expense, that by default kind of the bot, like, as in there is no moral or ethical compass. So even like practical example, George Bush wanting to go into
Yeah,
Iraq, there wasn't. We all know it was obviously like a kind of a cock and bull story about this weapons of
yeah.
mass destruction and the thousands of Iraqis that were murdered in the process. But it only, well, I guess it didn't necessarily benefit George Bush, but at the time it was seemed to benefit Bush in terms of 9/11. They needed to
Yeah.
seem like they were doing something in response, and that would have obviously bolstered his popularity or
Yeah.
his position as president back home. So I guess what I'm actually asking is, how does morality and ethics come into this military strategy? And I guess actually, how does Sun Tzu deal with it?
Yeah.
In obviously he doesn't exist, but how does the text deal with that kind of conceptual issue of morality or ethics being involved in this process?
So Swinza is very aware of image. So
Yeah,
he understands, and he understands morality in a slightly different way, which is that he perceives that a moral person, and let's be clear about this morality, and is that a moral person will not be deceived, will not be led astray by, if you will, bad ideas or like greed. Let's take something like greed. And let's assume for the moment that we're all to some extent greedy. How much? What are you willing to do to satisfy your greed? And at some point, you hit a wall. One hopes, where you're like, no, I won't. I won't do that for money because that's just immoral. But Swinza understands that you need to be a moral person to understand how people's morality works, how people's interests work. So you can't use spies unless if you have to have a sense of morality. Now it's not clear whether how that connects to strategy in a strict way, but if you are yourself completely immoral, you will actually not be able to understand people because some people are moral. In fact, most people have some fair amount of morality. If you think about really immoral people, they tend to assume everyone is immoral and treat them
yeah,
as such. And then they are confused because why would you know, that doesn't make sense to me. Whereas you need to be both a moral person and understand there are immoral people.
yeah.
But if like I want to manipulate you, I need to have a sense of morality. I need to have enough of a sense of what is right and
You,
wrong.
you need to know how I guess the other person would respond to certain triggers. Then I guess, like,
Yeah,
as in, you need to know their moral compass in order to
yeah.
guide them or work with them.
Well, and also there are people who don't want to follow someone who is obviously immoral. Now, people, of course, are self-deceptive. But if you think about that, people want to believe on some level, most people, or let even say a significant number of people want to believe that they are pursuing a course which is moral, that is correct and good, and therefore that's how they justify it to themselves. So
Yeah,
you have to argue to them that that's what you're doing. I'm a good person, or what we're doing is good for the country, so therefore you should do this. So that's an important aspect that Swinza understood, that you have to have that. And also, if you are, let's say if you're too greedy, if you're just unrelentingly greedy, you can always be manipulated. You have to have some boundaries and sense where, so if you offer me a lot of money to go give a lecture somewhere, and I think people should do that, but there are some people and groups that I would not knowingly do that for because I just wouldn't. Now that leaves a lot of people with a lot of money who really should have me lecture, but where I could go and not feel badly. I could go and feel this was enhancing my self, not just my pocketbook. So strategy isn't so much about. So let's say strategy is not a question of morality or not morality or ethics. Strategy is a question of what works and what the costs are. And so then what you have to apply is, are you willing to pay those costs? And that's where morality and ethics comes in. So let's say, you have an atom bomb. You are not willing to drop it on blank people because it's immoral, Now you can then there's the military argument. And unfortunately, in the United States, we have a whole field of political science and security studies that have attempted to render all of these calculations into rational, or they call it realist, and it's as much of a mislabel as anything, terms. And you have this argument about so why wasn't there a nuclear war between Russia and the United States? Was it because of rational calculations? Was it because of military calculations? Or, and it's very hard to prove, was it because of morality? Was it because the respective leaders who were in a position to make the decisions about going to war simply didn't do those things because they perceived it would have been morally, ethically wrong?
I guess you could also spin it on its head and say actually it's completely to do with I guess not complete immorality, because I guess that would argue someone would have dropped a nuclear bomb, but immorality to the extent of their own survival. Because I
Yeah.
guess if you nuke the other person too much, we all live on the same planet, so so you kind of screw yourself over.
Well, that's the rational strategic argument, which is
Yeah,
that we have mutually
mad.
assured destruction,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
therefore that's what keeps it from going. But what if all that's wrong? And this is where the historian comes in and says, what I want to know is not these abstract ideas. I want to know what the guys in a position to make these decisions were thinking. And if we actually studied that, if we could get at what these guys were thinking, and honestly, if you think about it, how many points were there really where anyone on either side was even considering it? There's only a couple of spots. And if you go in there, in fact, you may not find that these guys were they really thinking about, I mean, Richard Nixon, of all people, actually makes an argument in his book, and I forget which, that he says the notion that you're that as a strategy you have an option of annihilating the other side, and that's not that's immoral. He says it's immoral. I mean, I was reading this. Actually, by the way, Nixon's engagement with Sun Tzu's Art of War was actually quite good. Uh, and the Henry Kissinger really just kind of didn't really engage it at all. But Nixon actually makes, I mean, you're very,
Kissinger's the dude who died recently, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
the
yeah,
whole
yeah.
and all of the internet celebrated his passing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny because my colleague Tom Schwartz just published a book on Kissinger. And so I said, and he was always very hard to write a book on Kissinger because Kissinger would actually sue people writing about him
oh
if he didn't like
wow.
what they said. And but Kissinger had, he created this whole mythos about himself, and he did, again, if you want to talk about strategy and ruthless people and people who, and the thing is that at some point there's a ruthless person sometimes that we need to employ. And we don't want to know about it, right? It's that
Yeah,
what is it, Bismarck's thing about making policy, making laws, and it's a sausage making. You don't really want to know what goes into it.
yeah.
But there's a point where being strategic, and I will tell you this, that if you tell someone, if you describe someone your strategy, there's an awful lot of people who will be deeply offended that you have thought through why you should do the things you do,
Mm.
rather than kind of spontaneously just responding. A friend of mine just said to me a couple of weeks ago, he said that in all the years he's known me, about 12, 14 years, I have a plan. I have an understanding about why I'm doing the things I'm doing over time. And that includes, why I publish what I publish, when I publish it, and with respect to other things. And for me, it's not just about setting goals, but it's about understanding that it is more effective strategically in reaching my goals to do certain things in certain times in certain series. There's a lot of people who are very uncomfortable with that because they feel like you should be kind of just sort of spontaneously doing things. And that's so strategy tells you costs and benefits, right? So you know who you marry and what their interests are and your interest and what happens when you have kids and you know that's ruthless on a certain level, if you will. Like the understanding the costs and benefits. If you do this, you have these costs. Like we have cats rather than a dog. I would have preferred a dog to the cats, but I know that my lifestyle would have been bad for the dog. And the cats are more independent. The downside of the cats is they last longer. We've got a few more years on this set. But you if you say to someone that you've thought through things, there's a lot of people who are very uncomfortable with that, as if that it's wrong to be rational. It's wrong to think things through. And and I understand that, but and I'm not a spontaneous person at all, which I should preface all this by saying. So I'm really, I always say my wife's a superhero. She sees a problem, she wants to go fix it. I kind of go, let's look at this problem first and see whether there's anything we can do about it. And if we could do something about it, what could we do and what's it going to cost us?
Yeah, and how are we
And
going to do it? And right,
how are we
everyone's
going
like,
to do this? How are
okay,
we going to go about this? How's this
yeah,
going to
yeah,
work? And there are people who are that it takes away from it, right? Because we like the hero who runs toward the fire to rescue people, rather than the person who looks and says, "Yeah, I really can't do anything about that. And I'll call 911, I'll call 911, I'll call emergency services. That's not something I can do." That reeks of cowardice. And I am a coward, so I don't want to like downplay that. But it's also, caution. We don't value caution on a certain level because no one builds a great thing with caution. It's like, yeah, I don't know. There were actually probably a lot of things that were built by very cautious people. We just don't talk about them because it's not a very good story. It's like Bill Gates builds Microsoft. Everyone's like, he dropped out of Harvard to do that. You're like, he didn't take a risk. He got into Harvard. He didn't get into Harvard. He wasn't a poor child who had one scholarship chance. He got into Harvard because he was so smart, and he gave up that. And if he failed, his whole life would have been off track. He came from a very wealthy upper middle class background. Yeah, he left Harvard. He could have gone back if things didn't work out. He could have gone somewhere else. I'm not downplaying what he did and his intelligence in doing that and pursuing it. I'm just saying, looking at that and saying, what risk did he take? And if you sit there as someone who doesn't have his background and his resources, and you say, I'm going to be like him and I'm going to drop out of school and lose my scholarship and lose my chance to complete this in order to pursue this, yeah, that's a strategic choice. It's not the choice that I, as your professor, would recommend to you because I tend to be cautious. It might work out for you. It's a great story if it does work out for you, but it probably won't. But we're not going to talk about the 99 out of 100 or 999 out of 100 people who tried that, and well, and to get back to the 60s, I had a psychology professor in college who talked about he was interviewing homeless people. So this is whatever back in the 80s, or I don't know when he was doing the work, and he found out that all of these homeless people he was interviewing had done exactly what he had done when in the 60s, which is screwed around in college, dropped out of things, went off and he said, but the difference was the guys who were on the street came from much poorer backgrounds. And when he and his buddies didn't go, whatever, they messed around, then they went home, they went to their parents' house, raided the refrigerator. Their parents said, "Oh, what are you doing? You need some money. Here's some cash." And then when they got done messing around and having fun, they went back to school and they took up. Went out. And the guys who were homeless were people from much poorer backgrounds who had this moment, to get back to our moments with, Samuel Griffith, where it hits, but he had this moment where they had this opportunity to be in college and they got derailed by this social movement that was going on, by this cultural moment, and it screwed the rest of their lives because they went around with it and they weren't strategic enough to say, I got this chance now. This is my chance now. And if I give this up, it's not coming back. And that's always the difference between people of means and people of not means and countries of means. The United States can buy a lot of lottery tickets that small countries can't. Uh, and you can't play poker with someone who has more money than you do. because
Yeah, you
eventually,
can't run those same risks at
yeah,
all. No,
yeah,
no.
and their numbers are going to catch up for you. You have one
Eventually,
failure and you're out. They can have a failure
yeah,
and recover. So that's strategy, and strategy is understanding what you have, what your means are, what your risks are, and then there's
yeah,
morality. Do you give up? Do you do something immoral
yeah,
to get ahead? And you're balancing that out. And for some people, that morality is cheap. And
yeah,
for a lot of people, that morality is horrible. I,
yeah,
I abandoned this friend, or I did something terrible, and then you're in a Hollywood movie, right?
yeah.
You're haunted by that choice. And we're haunted by choices that we make at various times.
No, true.
Some of that is, but again, it's being strategic is being strategic is understanding that cost and benefit and knowing what's important for you. So that's the morality is what's important for you
Yeah,
and your morality versus your goals. So if it's important for you to be a good person, to get to the other side of things and still consider yourself a good person, then you're going to push other things down and not risk those things or not do
yeah.
those bad things. And people make bad calculations all the time. And they decide, no, it's worth more to me than my morality. And then they go, oh crap, no, actually, my
Too
morality.
late now.
Too late.
Yeah,
I did that thing I
yeah.
shouldn't have done.
But
And
then it's the whole conversation of means to an end,
yeah,
and the
yeah.
whole kind of philosophical debates about even if your intention's correct and it ends up backfiring, then like how do you kind of square that circle and
Well,
stuff? I
look,
guess.
I am one of a very small number of very fortunate individuals who managed both to get a PhD and get a job,
Yeah,
a tenure track and tenure job at a wealthy private university.
yeah,
I'm of a very small group of people,
yeah.
and the foolishness is thinking that somehow I got there because of merit rather than a lot of it is just it's just
Look,
fortune, it's luck.
yeah,
And like
yeah,
I'm really risk averse.
yeah, yeah.
So I don't want to try something when I want to lower the risk of failure as much as possible
It's
when I'm
possible.
doing something.
Yeah,
So, I went up for tenure. I had like, 4 books and 4 edited volumes and all this stuff because could I have tried to go earlier? Maybe, but why would I risk it?
yeah, 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 yeah,
Now, other people might have said, oh, I could have made, if I made it, I would have been making a bit more money earlier. I could have,
yeah,
was it
yeah.
worth the risk? So that's being strategic. Is that being immoral? I don't think so. Um, Other balances but there are moral choices that come in
I,
and.
I guess also with morality, the questioning of that 9 times out of 10 comes from outside of the decision maker.
Yeah,
So you deciding X, Y, and Z based on your own context makes sense to you because you're aware of your context. But the
yeah,
person outside of that can very easily be like, well, why didn't you think of this and why didn't you
yeah.
think of that or whatever, which is separate.
And historically, we run into the problem of we know how things turned out.
Yeah, and when hindsight's obviously that beautiful
Yeah,
curse, yeah,
and it makes morality a very. I mean, and
sticky
look, I
subject.
could never have been a great leader because I think even a great leader who's not an immoral monster and all those things has to make who understands things. I take someone like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR.
Yeah,
He had all kinds of flaws, but he also understood a lot of. He was very strategic, and you make certain choices in certain times. And can you imagine ordering hundreds of thousands of people into battle, and understanding the costs that
hmm,
you're going to pay for these larger things, and how many screw ups they're going to be, how many
yeah,
mistakes and unnecessary deaths, but there's no way to stop
get
that.
around that. Yeah, yeah,
So if you're not willing to do that, you can't really be a leader
a
because you're
leader.
going to say, well, wait, we can't do that. And well, why not? Well, but think of all the costs. Yeah, but there's the benefits, right?
Making those hard decisions. Yeah,
And so
yeah,
I never take the position. I mean, I don't want to judge. I try to judge historically how they went about it, whether what their calculations were, whether this made sense, and all those
yeah.
things. But there's a lot of moral judgment that or judgment about that. I can't criticize someone in their time and in their place for doing those things because that's not me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we're 9 times out of 10 using our modern kind of
Yeah,
viewpoint to judge them. Um, just coming to the last question,
yeah.
what are the implications of the Western interpretation of Sun Tzu's teaching for future military and strategic planning? And I guess also just in general, considering how deep Sun Tzu's Art of War has kind of seeped into modern culture in
Hmm.
terms of kind of, I'm sure you can get quotes with all sorts of on all sorts of kind of paraphernalia and apparel and
Yeah.
t-shirts and hats and whatever. And then even Paris Hilton, even what you were talking about earlier about her holding the book upside down, even that goes to show just how embedded
Yeah.
the art of war is as part of modern culture. So,
Yeah.
I guess what are some of those implications?
So the implications, the general cultural implications are, whatever they are. I mean, in the sense that, isn't there that, didn't Wesley Snipes do like some movie, The Art of War, and they're quoting stuff, and sure, I think Hollywood should pay me a lot of money as a consultant to come in, on set
Yes.
and eat their food and say yes, yes, no. But unfortunately, they're not going to, as far as I know. Like I said, I'm not opposed to it. Uh, I look at it much more in terms of the very real misunderstanding of the Chinese military right now and
Yeah.
Chinese intentions and strategies. And I have more recently, because of these issues, tended to be much more outspoken even than I was before, although I'm sure there are a lot of political scientists who would say I was pretty outspoken before in saying that a lot of our understanding, our planning based on political science models is dangerously flawed in it because of the nature of the intellectual project to make things into rational models, into reproducible models, rather than the historians, were looking at like, you know, every time is different. It's always a bit different. And if you just get it down to like, can you make things predictive? And I don't argue for that because I think, and one of the problems of teaching strategy, and it is my hope that I have been doing some things and some other people that we will introduce a better understanding of strategy in general, but Chinese perspectives on it in particular, into the thinking of, at the very least, the U.S. military. And I mean that in the sense also of not in the like, so we will fight a war and win, but in the sense of if you can have a better understanding, you don't stumble into a war. You know, don't think the other guy thinks the way you do. And if that could transcend up into from just sort of the military side into at least civilian leaderships who in America and in Great Britain and all these places actually make decisions, make these important decisions, that that they could understand these things in terms of, you know, you have to understand the other guy as the other guy understands himself, not as you would like to. Uh, and so there is this argument about whether there are people I know who say that the Chinese understand America reasonably well. I Those people are much smarter than I am, and they work on this stuff, and so I take that as probably true, but I have my doubts because it's one of those things you always imagine. Hans Delbruck said that when you look at another army, when a general looks at the other army, he looks at all the people, and when he looks at his own army, he discounts the camp followers and all the, he looks back and knows that he's got 20,000 troops and 20,000 camp followers who aren't troops. But when he looks at the other side, he sees 40,000 guys. And so you always have to guard against that notion that like Xi Jinping could probably decide by himself to invade Taiwan. That's that invalidates like almost any kind of security conception about how you deal with him because We don't know what his calculations are. And he could find himself in a situation where politically he needs it. So, but we don't know. He might not be taking it very seriously. We don't know, or I should say, I certainly don't know if there's some kind of secret information about that. I am not privy to it. Vladimir Putin decides things by himself. This completely destroys all of these larger structures of like how do you deter someone? How do you deter someone that you don't even know what would deter them? You don't know what their calculations are. So, we always talk about like so some crazy person comes up to you and is getting violent. How do you deter that? Well, I don't know. They're crazy. You can't. How do you get out of a situation? So what you end up with is what I've been my one of my favorite Mao quotes is he says, you fight your war and I'll fight mine, which is at a certain point the lesson that we need to learn in getting away from some of this political science concept is that our defenses and our values, and I think values are important when morality is important, is we have to be able to proceed based on what we perceive we're ready to do and interested in doing, rather than trying to convince other guys not to because isn't democracy wonderful? There's plenty of guys, that's the thing. We're like, democracy is so great. Why, this is Francis Fukuyama's, The End of History and the Last Man. And it's like, it's sort of like, but what did you do? It's back to, what's the influence of that book? Well, you came up with a great idea. The other guys weren't reading it. So you end up in this situation where you're imagining the other side understands things the way you do. They have a similar strategy to yours, and therefore you can match them move for move and convince them. This is the thing about signaling in strategy. Well, I'm going to do this, and that's going to signal to those guys, unless they don't get it, unless they don't understand it that way. So my feeling is, and this is quite the opposite of what a lot of people sort of intuitively feel, is that a better understanding of strategy, a better understanding of military history would lead to better decision making. Ideally, of course, the other side would also have the same education and same value set, but you can't rely on the other guy to be that way. So what you have to do is you have to prepare yourself for the eventualities that you can perceive and imagine, and maybe some that you. It's hard to prepare for the things you aren't. You have. It's a. How do you prepare for the things you haven't thought of? But you also have to have. But unfortunately, to do all those things is expensive. It is contrary to a lot of political values. So it's not just in the United States. We used to have the Republican Party was always, for military spending and for the military, and that's changed, which is very disconcerting because you could always count on them to back the military, and now they're not. And so now you have two parties that are kind of like, yeah, we don't, well, let's not spend much on the military. Like, well, that's great until you want it to do something. That's and if you decide that in war we're not going to need a lot of artillery shells, and that's what we decided. And then you get Ukraine, Russia's invading, and suddenly we're going through our shell supplies at an incredible rate. And they go, why is this happening? It's not supposed to happen. Well, you need them because your concepts were unrealistic. So just because we have new technology doesn't mean the old technology is no longer useful. And so at least in the United States, and I only speak from that perspective, our education with respect to strategy generally, and I should say actually our education in general has not been going very well for a lot of political reasons. We need a much more humanistic understanding of this. Strategy is humanistic. It's not social science. And social science has done great violence to strategy by trying to make it scientific. It's a humanistic discipline, and it always has been, and it's about developing judgment and understanding, and it requires education to do well. Do people get strategy right without education? Sure, some do. Do people who've had strategic education get things wrong?
Yeah.
Yes. And I've got a whole bunch of 11th century things where they actually talk about that. I mean, they literally talk about like this guy read this strategic text and got things wrong. This guy didn't read strategic text, he got things right.
Smashed it. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the value of strategic text? That's actually a military exam question.
But I guess it's like the people who don't revise at all, turn up to the exams, get 100%, and then there's people who are slogging away for months and months and turn up and just crumble and nothing happens.
Yeah, so you have all of these outcomes, but that doesn't mean that generally speaking, people who are more thoughtful are going to have a better outcome, right?
Yeah.
But what happens is people hold up that individual who didn't follow the conventional path or didn't do all the hard work. Oh, isn't it great, that person who was discovered as a singer and went on, as opposed to the person who was trained really well, and so we look at like Hollywood, where you have a small number of individuals, these stars, rather than us ordinary people who have to work hard and get an education. People, oh, you don't need a college education. It's like, look at the statistics. You're so much better off if you get a college education.
We're getting one,
But yeah, you got to put the money in, and no, it may not be, if you want to be strategic, maybe you shouldn't go in debt to go to maybe it's not worth it to go into debt to go to that better university for your education strategically. But it is worth it for you to go to that, to not go in debt or not go into debt as much, to go to that less good university to get that degree. Is the better university degree better? Well, obviously I have to say yes, because I'm at that university, but it's not 100% better necessarily. It might be 5% better. But we all know that in life, those little increments
make a big difference.
I was watching this video of these guys, the world's strongest men, and this one guy saying to the other guy, well, these training methods each one might get you 1%. But if you get 5%, that's another, he's like, oh, that'll be like another 24 kilos when you're doing this deadlift. That's the difference between being the champion and not. And so like every increment at every point is an advantage. It's not necessarily by itself decisive, but that comes from strategic thinking, and that you pursue a goal in a rational manner with your means, and you're balancing means and ends. And it doesn't mean you succeed because you were being strategic. It means you're trying to increase your chances of success, decrease your chances of failure, decrease your chances of catastrophic failure. A lot of strategy, as we talk about victory and defeat, a lot of it is not losing. So not being defeated is a very important strategy, and preventing the other guy from winning. So sometimes it's not win or loss, it's not lose, not win. And people find that, that's my jujitsu strategy, is not lose. So I'm very defensive. I'm trying to prevent the other guy from winning until I can get to a position that may be advantageous for me. But I'm not like, I'm just going to go in and, because I can't do that. And so for a country, for a state, for a leader, strategy is very deep on that.
Yeah, no, definitely. We've been talking for just over 2 hours. I just want to say I've gotten through all the questions that I had prepared. Obviously, I have to say thank you for those answers, because that was definitely extensive and really, really quite interesting. I just wanted to double check. Is there anything that you think is worth mentioning that we haven't mentioned so far, or anything that you just think is worth including before we wrap up?
I mean, I mentioned all the things about everybody should buy the book,
of
so that I can live better, and people should hire me for at great expense,
and buy you better wine, or at least provide you the means to.
They don't have to buy it. They just need to provide me.
Yes, the means in order for that.
No choice.